So as we begin 2021, I've been struck by a phrase that you've probably heard quite a bit recently. This phrase, getting back to normal. I think it's safe to say that we're all excited about this prospect that this year is going to be the year when we resume this sense of normality, when our lives start to get back to how they were before coronavirus and before all of this that happened last year. But I've also been struck by something else. I've been struck by this feeling that actually Jesus calls us to more than just normality, doesn't he? Jesus calls us as his followers to live lives that are extraordinary, to live lives that are completely countercultural. 2,000 years ago, Jesus invited his followers to go up a mountain with him. And there he preached this most incredible sermon. We call it the Sermon on the Mount. And there he laid down what we might describe as the norms of his kingdom. He told them what it looks like to live as one of his followers, to live in the kingdom of heaven. And if we're honest, it would be safe to say that the norms of the kingdom of heaven are very, very different from the norms and the values of this world in which we live. And so over the next few weeks and months, we're going to take a look at this sermon. We're going to take a look at some of the things Jesus said about living in his kingdom and about being his followers. And it's my hope and prayer that we'll see just how countercultural this is, just how unnormal it is to be a follower of Jesus. And as we do this, we'll be equipped to follow him better. But we'll also see some of these amazing promises that he gives us. But he says, being a follower of him isn't just countercultural. It also comes with some amazing blessings. And so we'll start today, at the start of his sermon, we'll dive into Matthew chapter 5 and verses 1 to 12, and we'll look at the Beatitudes. So let's jump in, shall we? Matthew chapter 5. This is what Jesus has to say. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So then the word beatitude comes from the Latin word beatus, which means blessing. It means God's approval, God's favour. But notice that God's favour here, God's approval, comes in a very different way from the favour or the approval of the world, doesn't it? The world around us tends to approve of those who are successful, doesn't it? Those who are rich and famous, those who are winners. Every year Time magazine picks a person of the year. And do you know who Time magazine's person of the year was for 2020? It was Joe Biden, the president-elect of the United States. But I've got a feeling that he probably wouldn't have been chosen as the person of the year had he lost the election, would he? because our world, our culture, tends to venerate winners. It tends to venerate successful people, those who get ahead in life. But we'll see that these Beatitudes are very different. But the norms of Jesus' kingdom is very different from the way of the world. So let's take a look, shall we? We won't have time to look at all of these Beatitudes in huge depth, but hopefully as we skim over them, you might notice something interesting, and hopefully you might notice something quite important. That there's a bit of a pattern that emerges as we'll look at these Beatitudes. There's a bit of a movement from one to the next. What one theologian called a golden chain. And that's important because what it shows us is that this isn't just a list of commands. This isn't just Jesus saying, right, here's what you need to do. He's not just saying, right, do this in order to get into my kingdom. This is Jesus saying, no, here is what life looks like if you are in my kingdom. Now, this is what it looks like if you are my follower. Do you see the difference there? Now, hopefully, as we go through these, it'll sort of start to become clear what I mean by that. But anyway, let's jump in and let's take a look at the first of these Beatitudes. There we go. We see number 1. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So the question is, well, what does it mean to be poor in spirit? You see, it doesn't necessarily mean to be materially poor. Well, it doesn't actually exclude that. But I think it means to recognize your spiritual bankruptcy before God. It means to admit that despite what we might think, we're actually not the captains of our own soul. We're not the masters of our own fates. And despite what we might like to think of ourselves, we don't have it all together. And if this last year has taught us anything, then surely it's that, isn't it? Surely it's taught us just how small we are, just how powerless we are. In the grand scheme of things, we can't control what happens to us, can we? And to be poor in spirit is to be aware of that. It's to be aware of actually how powerless we truly are. And therefore, in response to that awareness, to humble ourselves before God. And Jesus says this is the first step in his kingdom. This is the first thing his followers have to do. Scottish theologian Sinclair Ferguson puts it like this. He says, the kingdom life is one of being filled with God's blessing. But first we have to be emptied. Because by nature we are too full of ourselves to be filled with God. So we need to ask ourselves, don't we? Are we emptying ourselves? Are we emptying ourselves of our arrogance and our self-sufficiency? Because it's only by doing that we can start to be filled by God and by the blessing that he wants us to have. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they are the ones that will receive the kingdom of heaven. This is the first step. Secondly then, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And so think about it. As we realize that we are spiritually bankrupt, what is the natural response? We mourn, don't we? We realize that actually we have broken God's laws. We have sinned against him. We have hurt him and we have hurt others. We have damaged his creation. And therefore we grieve. We lament. We repent. And as we do this, we have this amazing promise that God will comfort us, that God will forgive us, that God will welcome us. This is an amazing promise because it's more than just a promise that those who are mourning in this life will be comforted. Although that is true, isn't it? But it's saying that those who are mourning over their sin, those who are mourning spiritually, will find forgiveness. They will find comfort, both in this life and in the next. What an incredible promise that is. And then notice the next link in the chain. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. So we've humbled ourselves before God. We've mourned over our sinfulness, over our spiritual bankruptcy. And we might be thinking, well, okay, but what does meekness have to do with it? The thing is, when you realize that actually you are spiritually poor, and when you're mourning because of it, that's going to lead to a certain meekness, isn't it? That's going to lead to you not lording it over other people, not sort of trying to claim your rights over other people, not demanding to be treated specially, because you're going to realize that actually you aren't special. You have no particular merit, certainly not before God. You're going to have this humility, not just before God, but before other people as well. And we're going to start to have this humbleness in life, this meekness. When we realize that actually we have nothing to offer God, that's going to start to play out in our interactions with other people, isn't it? Blessed are the meek. And then Jesus goes on, because of all of this, our affections start to change. Our desires, our tastes, the things that we want out of life. Jesus puts it like this: blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. We see that being filled with God leads to blessing. And so we begin to hunger and thirst for more of that, for more of him. Not because we have to, not because someone has told us to, not because it's some religious duty, but just because it starts to come naturally to us. When we realize that we are poor in spirit, when we start to humble ourselves before God, then we start to receive his blessing and we start to be filled by him. And naturally we come to want more and more of that. We start to want the world and the things of the world less and less and less. And we start to want the things of God more and more and more. We start to hunger and thirst for what God says is right and good. I remember when I was a teenager, before I came to Christ, and if you'd said to me, but one day I would enjoy going to church, and I would enjoy singing hymns and praying prayers and listening to sermons even. If you had said that to me, I would have thought that you were crazy. But now, I do. I think that those things are a thrill and a joy. I hunger for spending time in church and listening to sermons. That's what this does to us, isn't it? That's what being part of God's kingdom is like. But it's worth pausing here for a second to consider a quote by Martin Lloyd-Jones. I think this is really challenging and really important. He said this about this verse. They do not know of a better test that anyone can apply to himself or herself in the whole matter of the Christian life than a verse like this. If this verse is one of the most blessed statements of the whole of Scripture, then you can be quite certain you are a Christian. If it is not, then you'd better examine the foundations again. What he's saying here is when you read this verse, how you respond to it is a bit like a litmus test for your faith. He's saying, does it make you think, yeah, that describes me. That is true of me. I hunger and thirst for righteousness. I want to know more of God. I want to grow closer to him. Yeah, that is true of me. He's saying, if you read this verse and you respond like that, then you can be sure that you are a Christian. You can be sure that you are on the right track. But on the other hand, if you read this verse and you respond, well, no, that doesn't describe me at all. I wouldn't say that. I come to church. I think I'm a Christian. I know all of this, but I don't hunger and thirst for righteousness. I'm not one of those lot. Well then, Jesus says, you better take another look at yourself. You better have another think about what it really means to be part of his kingdom. He said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. So then speeding up a little bit, otherwise perhaps we'll never get through this. And Jesus says, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. So in other words, when we know what it is to be blessed by God, even though we're spiritually poor, and when we know what it is to mourn over our sin and to be comforted for it, when we know that we have been humbled, when we know that we've had our desires realigned and focused on God, then we start to see other people in a different light, don't we? We begin to treat other people with that same kind of mercy that we ourselves have received. After all, how can we not? When we have received such mercy from God, when he has forgiven us so much, when he has accepted us who are spiritually bankrupt into his kingdom, and when he has treated us as sons and daughters, even though in reality we are rebels against him. When he has lavished grace upon us, even though we deserve nothing. How can we refuse to treat others in the same way? we naturally begin to have mercy on others, don't we? Blessed are the merciful. Those who are in his kingdom become merciful. It's just a natural outcome of being part of his kingdom. And then he says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Do you see how it's all connected yet? Jesus says that we are pure in heart. We're not just pure on the outside. And this is a theme that's going to come up again and again in the Sermon on the Mount. That this purity isn't just sort of an outward show. It's not just a religious duty, but it's something that is coming from the heart. And this purity comes because we're truly seeking righteousness. We're truly aware of our spiritual poverty. We're truly mourning our sinfulness. And therefore it's truly coming from the heart. We're truly wanting to be pure. We're truly wanting to please God, to have his approval. And therefore we're not just wanting to put on a show for people. We're not just wanting to look good. We're truly wanting to be pure for the Lord. And therefore we seek this spiritual purity from the heart, don't we? And when Jesus says that we have this purity, not just an outward sense of religiousness, but this true purity of heart, then we will be the kind of people who will see God. The kind of people who will experience a closeness with the Lord. And finally, when we see God, we see the peace of God, don't we? When we experience closeness with God, we experience his peace. And when we experience his peace, it's only natural that we want to share that peace with others. We become peacemakers. We become those who want to spread the peace of God as far as we can. Be those who share peace to our friends, our neighbours, our communities, our world. Because when you've experienced something as amazing, as blessed as the peace of God, you just can't keep it to yourself, can you? We become peacemakers. And so, aren't these wonderful promises? And you see how they're not just commands. Jesus isn't just saying, right, here's what you've got to go and do. Try your very best to be peacemakers. Try to be pure at heart. Try to be merciful. This is so much more than just a list of do's and don'ts, isn't it? Jesus is saying these glorious declarations. He's saying, this is my kingdom. If you are one of my followers, this is what's going to happen to you. This is your new normal. And so we'll carry on over the next few weeks. We'll look at the last couple of Beatitudes. We'll look at Jesus' sayings about salt and light. And then we'll dig into the rest of the Sermon on the Mount as well. But for now, let me just end with a quick story. Now, I don't know this personally, but I'm told that when Prince Charles was young, if he ever misbehaved, one of the ways that his parents would discipline him was simply by sitting him down and saying to him, "My boy, remember who you are." In other words, Remember that you are a prince. You are royalty. Now act like it. And in the Beatitudes, it's like Jesus is saying a similar thing to us, isn't it? He's saying to us that we are part of his kingdom. We are part of the kingdom of heaven. We are children of God. And the invitation to us now is simply to act in accordance to not the norms of this world, but to remember who we are. That there is a new normal, the norms of the kingdom of heaven, and it is far more glorious. Remember who you are.